Hi, welcome back to my channel. I hope you are well. Today I'm going to be talking about one of Canada's youngest serial killers. They sort of consider him a teenage serial killer online because he was still a teenager. He was 19 years old when he begun his serial killing spree in 2009. So this is the story of Cody Legebokoff. But before I get into it, I make commentary and true crime videos, so if that's something you're interested in, please subscribe and like if you want to. Yep, let's get into it. Cody Allen Legebokoff was born on January 21st, 1990 to two loving parents, though I couldn't find their names available anywhere online. I also couldn't find exactly how many siblings Cody has. I couldn't find how many siblings Cody has, but it is at least two, a younger sister and an older brother whose names are also not publicly available. So Cody was born in Fort St. James, which is a very small rural municipality in British Columbia. It has a population of only around 1,500 people. By all accounts, Cody had a pretty normal upbringing. His grandfather, Roy Goodwin, says that, quote, "He had a good upbringing. Everything was perfect. I hunted with him. I fished with him. We did everything, and he was a perfectly normal child." This is consistent with other accounts of Cody's childhood and just the Legebokoff family in general. Many say they were just a typical family from Fort St. James. They were very hardworking and it seemed fairly well respected around Fort St. James. His mother's family, the Goodwin family, owned a sawmill which they then sold and made millions off of in 2009, and that's where his family, the Legebokoff family, got most of their money. Apparently, Cody was also pretty popular and well liked by his peers in school and his teachers throughout his entire growing up. Cody was described as just your average country boy. He just listened to country music, hunted, fished, just enjoyed rural activities like that. He was also fairly athletic as well. In high school, he played and competed in downhill skiing and snowboarding. He also grew up playing hockey, which is pretty typical for a lot of people growing up in Canada, as we are pretty big on our winter sports. He even competed in the 2002 Challenge Cup, which is an international hockey tournament that is held in Vancouver every year, so I guess he was pretty good at hockey. It states online that Cody Legebokoff and his two siblings attended the local high school in Fort St. James, which was of course called Fort St. James Secondary School. He graduated from high school in 2008 and promptly moved to Lethbridge, Alberta. He then moved back to British Columbia in 2009. He moved to Prince George, British Columbia, which is a bigger city in British Columbia, which the population is around 74,000, so not huge, but bigger than Cody was used to. Prince George is also a less than 2-hour drive from Cody's hometown or home municipality in Fort St. James. Once he moved to Prince George, he began to work as a mechanic at a local Ford car dealership. In August 2009, Cody Legebokoff decided to rent a house in Prince George with 3 female roommates who he had known from back home in Fort St. James. His 3 roommates were Jana Lidl, Sadie Burgard, and Jasmine Lukniak. As I said, the 4 knew each other from Fort St. James, where they had all grown up together. His 3 roommates said that they noticed Cody had begun to use drugs shortly after they moved in together, specifically cocaine. After moving to Prince George, he met a young woman named Amy Vowell in the summer of 2010 because they were co-workers at the Ford dealership, and they started dating shortly after meeting. She was also a student at the College of New Caledonia. So as I said, the pair started dating in September 2010. And Amy said that she would sleep over at Cody's house 3 to 4 times a week. He even brought her home for that Thanksgiving in October 2010. Canadian Thanksgiving is in October, not November. They dated for 3 months up until Cody's arrest in November 2010. It is believed that Cody Legebokoff started targeting and murdering women in late 2009 up until his arrest on November 27, 2010. Currently, 4 murders have been attributed to Cody Legebokoff, but it's still a possibility that he has more unknown victims, and it is a possibility that he may have harmed women in Alberta when he lived there. Cody Legebokoff's first known victim is Jill Stacy Stuchenko. Jill was born on December 2nd, 1973, and was 35 years old at the time she went missing, which was in October of 2009. She was last seen alive on October 9th, 2009. Jill was a mother of 6 children. At the time of her disappearance, they were aged 2 to 14. She had 2 girls and 4 boys, and many who knew her reported that Jill loved her children with her whole being. At the time of her disappearance, she was working as a sex worker for several different escorting agencies located in Prince George. Unfortunately, Jill did struggle with drug addiction and was home insecure as a result of her addictions, but she was still known for being incredibly kind and having a beautiful singing voice. At the time of her disappearance, Jill Stuchenko was engaged to a man named Leonard Kinney. Leonard had been arrested and convicted of physically assaulting Jill on more than 1 occasion, so it appears that they had an abusive relationship, as he was convicted at least 2 times. He claims that the fights were over her drug use and her involvement in sex work because he wanted them to be a family. The part that is confusing to me is that they were apparently engaged at the time of Jill's disappearance, but they didn't live together and had limited communication with each other. Leonard claimed they were in a better place just before she went missing, but he literally didn't even realize she was missing until weeks later, when he read like an article in the newspaper that Jill Stuchenko was missing. There was another man who was sort of involved with Jill named Jim Giller. He met Jill after he had hired her for her sex work, but then he started developing a liking towards her and just feelings towards Jill and just wanted to help her out because she was in a tough spot with her addiction. Jill lived with Jim on and off for a while. She would apparently stay at his house for 3 to 4 days at a time without using, and then when she had a drug craving, she would leave his cabin that he lived at and go back into Prince George to gain money through sex work and get drugs. While staying at his house, Jim said he looked after Jill. They would cook together and swim together in a nearby lake. He said that Jill would often spend time in his sunroom reading self-help books, because many around her said that she was trying to recover from her addictions and get back to her family at the time of her disappearance. Even when she was in the city, Jill and Jim stayed in frequent contact. He pulled away from helping her a bit closer to her disappearance after he got involved in a scary situation with Jill and a drug dealer when she had a $500 drug debt that then paid off to get her out of the situation. It appears that Jim saw Jill even less when her boyfriend slash fiance, Leonard Kinney, got out of jail just a month or so before Jill went missing. As I said, Leonard was in jail at that time for physically assaulting Jill, but it is believed that Jim was the last person to see Jill alive on Friday, October 9th, 2009. Jill had called him earlier that day and asked him to meet her. They hung out for a bit, and Jim left her to go to his sister's house for Thanksgiving. He had invited Jill to come with him, but Jill had refused. He also called her later that night to check up on her. Jim says that he might have seen Jill on October 11th, 2009, but they can't 100% verify that sighting. So police believe that she was last seen alive on October 9th, 2009. Nobody saw Jill for the next week or so. But then her family and friends, after not hearing from her for a week, started to become worried about her because of her lifestyle. They were worried for her safety. She was finally reported missing by family and friends on October 22nd, 2009. They searched for her and posted missing persons posters around Prince George. Unfortunately, Jill's body was found half buried in a gravel pit 4 days later on October 26, 2009. The coroner found that Jill had suffered 2 lacerations to her head, one on her right ear and then one on the back of her head, which fractured her skull. This means that her attacker hit her at least twice in the head with a weapon with such force that she was immediately knocked out or killed. She also had defensive wounds on her arms and her hands, like bruises, which meant she fought back against her attacker. The coroner concluded that Jill was also sexually assaulted before her murder due to injuries discovered, such as bruising and tearing. She had cocaine in her system at the time of her death. It was ultimately determined that Jill's cause of death was blunt force trauma from the blows to her head. It was estimated that she was killed around 9 to 10 days before her body was found. Cody Legebokoff's second victim, whose body was found, was Cynthia Frances Maas. Cynthia was born on May 26, 1975. One of her sisters, Cody Maas, said that herself and her sister Cynthia both unfortunately grew up in foster care. They were both born in Blueberry River, which is a First Nations community in northeast British Columbia. One of her siblings said that the family used to call Cynthia Cinderella because she was the youngest sibling. It's unclear how many siblings Cynthia had in total. Cody Maas said that Cynthia had difficulties growing up, and it was discovered later in her adulthood that Cynthia was suffering from FASD, which is fetal alcohol syndrome. Cynthia wasn't diagnosed with FASD until later in her adulthood because the healthcare system in Canada for Indigenous people is corrupt and doesn't work the way it should be, which is exemplified in the case of Jordan's principle. So I'm just going to go briefly into that so you better understand Cynthia's growing up. So if you aren't aware, Jordan's principle originated from the tragic death of 5-year-old Jordan River Anderson. Essentially, Jordan River Anderson was a little Indigenous boy who was born in 1999 with a rare disorder. He was hospitalized for the first 2 years of his life before doctors decided that it would be best for him to move into a house closer to the hospital where he would receive in-home treatment for his disorder. In Canada, a lot of people's individual health cares are paid by our provincial governments. However, for Indigenous people in Canada, the jurisdictions around things like healthcare are a little different. So there was no clear legislation at the time over which level of government was responsible for the healthcare of Indigenous people. Like, they didn't know if it was going to be at a provincial or a federal level. At the time, as I said, the government hadn't determined which level of government would pay for Indigenous people's healthcare. So when it came to Jordan, the provincial and federal governments fought within court for years trying to determine which one of them would be responsible to pay for his medical expenses. While they were fighting, no one was paying for Jordan's healthcare treatment, so he had remained in the hospital for the next 3 years and sadly passed away at just 5 years old without ever leaving the hospital and receiving the in-home treatment he needed. After his death, Canada passed Jordan's principle, which prevents this from ever happening again. So I'm making an educated guess that Cynthia's situation was similar to Jordan's. Like, they couldn't figure out who would pay for her medical expenses, so she just didn't receive any treatment that would have diagnosed her with FASD and treated it. Cynthia and her family had a rough childhood and a rough growing up. Cynthia's sister Judy said that Cynthia first tried drugs when she was babysitting for a cousin and someone offered her some. Since she had undiagnosed FASD at the time, she fell quickly into addiction after this, as people with FASD are more susceptible to things like drug addiction. In her early adult life, she got into a relationship with an unidentified man who Judy says was abusive to Cynthia. Cynthia moved to Edmonton from British Columbia to Edmonton to be with that man, and she quickly became pregnant after moving there. After she discovered she was pregnant, Cynthia wanted to change her life for her kid. She wanted to get sober and prepare for the birth of her child, so she returned to Fort St. John, which is also a city in British Columbia, where she had family support. Cynthia tried her best for her baby. She attended treatment for her addiction in both Vancouver and Prince George, but she still struggled, and sadly, her baby was put into foster care after it was born. Despite this, Cynthia still fought hard to get her baby back, but Judy says that she was never given the proper help and support that she needed to be successful as a parent. In the meantime, Cynthia continued to struggle with addiction and worked as a sex worker as a means to survive. She was last seen on September 10th, 2010 in the area of Juniper Street and 19th Avenue in Prince George. Her family reported her missing on September 23rd, 2010 after they couldn't reach her when they tried to check up on her. Sadly, Cynthia's remains were found almost a month after she was last seen on October 8th, 2018 in Elsie Gunn Park, which is a park in Prince George that is a common hot spot for sex workers to go to. She was 35 years old at the time of her death, and by the time her remains had been found, she was badly decomposed, so it was mostly skeletal remains, so an autopsy on her body was a lot more difficult than it was on Jill Stuchenko's body, who had only been out in the elements for 9 to 10 days. It is believed that Cynthia was killed around a month before she was found, so basically right after she went missing, she was murdered. The autopsy found many injuries to Cynthia's body, but they couldn't really determine if she was sexually assaulted because of the state of decomposition that her body was in, but there were fractures and lacerations to her head and face which were consistent with being hit with a blunt object repeatedly, like Jill was. They also found that she had been stabbed in the throat and her right shoulder with either a knife or a similar sharp object. She also had defensive wounds similar to Jill, like bruises on her arms and hands. Cynthia also had cocaine in her system like Jill did. She also had marijuana and an antidepressant. Her cause of death was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma and stab wounds. Cody Legebokoff's next victim, but this is actually before Cynthia, but her body has never found. So the next victim that I'm going to be talking about is Natasha Lynn Montgomery, who was born on March 14th, 1987. Natasha grew up with family in Quesnel, British Columbia, which is around an hour and a half drive away from Prince George. She was born to parents Luann Montgomery and Todd Eason, and many who loved her referred to her as Tasha. Luann said that Natasha was a great child in and outside of school. She was very athletic growing up too. She figure skated and played softball. Luann said her daughter Natasha was first introduced to drugs in high school when she was around 17 years old. She quickly became addicted, unfortunately, often skipping classes to use drugs in the school bathroom. Luann struggled to help her daughter become and remain sober because she had little authority over Natasha after she turned 18. Natasha eventually agreed with her family to enter a rehabilitation center, and after being released, she returned to school and got her high school diploma. Natasha did her best to remain sober, and for years she was sober. She still enjoyed partying and socializing with friends, but she tried to be responsible by having her mother pick her up and drop her off at parties to hold her accountable for not using. Natasha gave birth to her first child when she was 19 years old and her second child at 20 with her former boyfriend, Brian Godwin. Brian and Natasha lived together for a while, raising their 2 kids together. Both Brian and Luann said Natasha's kids were her ultimate priority. They were the most important thing to her. Shortly after she started using again, she fled from Prince George to Quesnel out of fear for her life because she was involved with some shady people in Quesnel, so she ran away. While in Prince George, she called her mother, Brian, and her children nearly every day. While she lived in Prince George, she also survived by working as a sex worker. Resulting from her involvement in sex work and her struggle with drug addiction, Natasha was in and out of jail for most of 2010 up until her disappearance. Natasha was actually released from Prince George Regional Correctional Center. I don't know what her offense was for, but she was released on August 19th, 2010. After her release, she began staying with a man named Jeffrey Menton, who sold crack cocaine out of his apartment. After an acquaintance asked him to house Natasha for a few weeks, which he agreed to. She stayed there for the next 2 weeks up until her disappearance. He became concerned when she stopped returning to the apartment, so he tried to get in contact with her through email on September 1st, 2010. On August 26th, Natasha called her mom, and Luann said they made plans for her to return to Quesnel, reunite with her kids, and they discussed her going back to rehab for her addiction. This was the last time that Luann ever heard from her daughter, which was very strange because they kept in contact on basically a daily basis. Luann had no way to reach her daughter after this, as Natasha always placed the phone calls to her because she didn't have a consistent phone number or cell phone, and she began to worry after not hearing or being called by Natasha for weeks. Natasha's former boyfriend Brian Godwin said that he heard from Natasha around a week after she was released from jail, so probably around the same time that Luann last heard from her. Natasha told Brian she wanted to return to Quesnel like that night, but Brian couldn't find a ride to send out to Natasha to get picked up and returned to Quesnel, so he said he wired her money to buy a bus ticket back home, and that this was the last time he heard from her. Natasha was last seen either late August 31st or early in the morning on September 1st, 2010, in the area of 3rd Avenue and Queensway Street by Robert Forsyth, who was an acquaintance she had met a few weeks prior to that. He had dropped her off at a gas station around 7 to 8 p.m. on August 31st, and Natasha had told him she would call him later that night, but she never did call him, and this was the last time Natasha was seen alive. After not hearing from Natasha for a few weeks, Luann decided to get in her car and go down to Prince George to search for Natasha. She did this twice in the month of September and sort of asked around and went to places that Natasha frequented, but no one had seen her. So Luann finally reported Natasha missing on September 23rd, 2010. To this day, her body has never been located, though it is believed that she died sometime between August 31st and September 1st, making her the second victim of Cody Legebokoff, or the second known victim of Cody Legebokoff. She was 23 years old at the time of her disappearance, and Luann gained custody of Natasha's 2 children after Natasha's disappearance. What is sort of interesting is Natasha's recorded relationship with Cody Legebokoff. Natasha and Cody had met through a mutual friend who Cody was sort of having a sexual relationship with, Nikita Cunningham. Nikita and Natasha knew each other because they had both grown up in Quesnel. Nikita and Cody themselves met at a barbecue in Prince George, and then shortly after this barbecue they began to hang out, and then one time when they were hanging out, Nikita brought Natasha over to Cody's house sometime in the summer of 2010 to use drugs. So Natasha and Cody Legebokoff had met for the first time shortly before Natasha went missing. Lauren Dawn Leslie was Cody Legebokoff's 4th and final victim. Lauren Dawn Leslie was born on January 5th, 1995 to parents Donna Marie and Doug Leslie in Vanderhoof, British Columbia. Lauren had 3 siblings, Ricky, Megan, and Robert. When Lauren was young, and when the kids and her siblings were young, Donna Marie stayed at home to raise the kids while her husband at the time, Doug, worked full-time to financially support the family. Both Donna Marie and Doug described Lauren as a lovely child. Doug said Lauren loved swimming, boating, and karate. She had a blue belt at the time of her murder. Lauren was also legally blind. She was completely blind in one eye and had around 50% vision in her other eye, and this was caused by a genetic disorder that she had been born with. At the time of her death, Lauren Leslie was a 10th grade student at a local high school in Vanderhoof. Her parents, Doug and Donna Maria, were divorced at the time of her murder. So Lauren was currently living with her mother primarily in Fraser Lake, which is a town close to Vanderhoof, but her parents did share custody, so she also had a room and frequently stayed with her father, Doug, as well. Nexopia is apparently a Canadian social media website, though I, a Canadian, have literally never heard of it or don't know anyone who's ever used it, but apparently it was more popular in British Columbia. Anyways, it appears similar to websites such as Facebook or MySpace. Like, you have your own profile and then you can add people that live near you to talk to and stuff like that. A few weeks before her murder, Lauren began talking to someone on Nexopia with the handle One Country Boy. This username belonged to Cody Legebokoff, who had first reached out to Lauren Dawn Leslie on November 1st, 2010. And then the two began to communicate through the site and became fast friends. Lauren was using Nexopia just to make new friends. She wanted to socialize and meet new people, but Cody had other motivations for using the site. Most of their conversations consisted of 20-year-old Cody Legebokoff asking 15-year-old Lauren about her sexual preferences and experiences. When Cody would ask these questions, Lauren would either blatantly ignore them, try to change the subject, or just kind of joke it off but not answer. Cody and Lauren were both aware of each other's ages. On November 27th, 2010, which was a Saturday, Lauren spent the day with her mother. Around 3:30 p.m., Cody Legebokoff texted Lauren and first tried to arrange for them to meet up later that night, presumably because Cody wanted to have sex with Lauren. That day, Cody Legebokoff's girlfriend Amy was over at his apartment, but she left at around 6:30 p.m. Around minutes after Amy left, at 6:31, Cody replied to Lauren to definitively confirm their plans for that night. Cody then tells Lauren not to tell anybody about their meeting, and Lauren asks why and clarifies that she doesn't want anything sexual to happen between them. Cody tells Lauren that he will buy her alcohol, and then Lauren asks for chocolate mudslides, and they arrange to meet up at a local elementary school where Cody will pick her up and they will drive around and drink. At around 8 p.m. on that night, on November 27th, Lauren tells her mother that she is going to meet up with one of her girlfriends at a nearby Tim Hortons. Donna Marie tells Lauren to be home no later than 1 a.m., which is her curfew. Cody last texted Lauren just before 8:30 p.m. after purchasing the alcohol, and the pair met up at the elementary school around 8:30 p.m. A witness, who was a man named Richard Ruth, testified that he saw someone get out of a dark colored truck around 8:30 p.m. at the elementary school and walk towards a young girl who was on a swing. Lauren's last texts were to her friend Charity Funk at around 8:35 p.m. She told Charity that she was out driving with a friend from Prince George. After meeting up, Cody claimed that the two both drank their respective alcoholic beverages. Cody then claims, which is most likely a lie, that the two had consensual sex in the elementary school parking lot before driving to a logging road off of Highway 27, which is around a 20 to 25 minute drive away from the elementary school, where he said they had sex again. So around this time, on the evening of November 27, 2010, at around 9:30 p.m., Constable Aaron Keller, who is an officer with the RCMP, was also driving along Highway 27 to meet his coworker, whose name is Constable Sidhu. At this time, Keller had only been working as a constable for the RCMP for less than 1 year. As he was driving along Highway 27, he spotted a black pickup truck quickly pull out of a logging road that connected to Highway 27 and speed down Highway 27 at astronomical speed rates. Keller reported that the truck was driving erratically and very fast, so he decided to keep an eye on the truck just to monitor it, so he tailed it. Keller, who was unsure if it was going to be a dangerous situation, called his partner, Constable Sidhu, for a backup, and then when his partner arrived, they both pulled over the speeding truck together. So this was now around maybe 9:45 p.m. The officers both approached the truck together at both sides of the truck. Keller goes to the driver's side. Keller, when he finally approached the driver, he noticed that the driver had blood on his chin and his legs. And then Keller noticed an open beer can in the car, which an open can in a car is illegal in Canada. So the officers told the man inside, which of course was Cody Legebokoff, to get out of the car so they could search it. When Cody stepped out of his truck, Keller noticed even more blood on Cody. There was blood on his lower legs and a blood smear on his shoe. In response to the blood being present on his body, Cody said that he had killed a few grouse earlier that day, which was why he was bloody. The officers patted Cody down and found a multi-tool which had little blades, knife blades on it, and it was covered in blood. And then they also found a cell phone in one of his pockets, which later turned out to be Lauren's cell phone. While searching the car, the officers then discovered a plethora of concerning things that would later turn out to be evidence in the murder trial. They found alcohol, including the half-consumed mudslides. They found crack pipes and a pipe wrench, which was also covered in fresh blood. The officers also found a monkey backpack lying on the passenger side seat. Inside was a wallet and the medical ID of Lauren Dawn Leslie. At some point, Keller ran Lauren's name through the database and discovered that Lauren had been reported missing. The officers again asked why there was so much blood present. There was actually also a little pile of blood under Cody's feet in the car, so they asked Cody again why there was so much blood on him and in the car. Cody then admitted that he and a friend from Vanderhoof had drove out to hunt and found a deer, which Cody and his friend shot, stabbed, and then clubbed to death with the wrench, which was why the wrench was bloody. They then put the deer's body in the truck and it dumped it just off a logging road off of Highway 27. Cody didn't have a hunting license, so he was arrested for poaching at this time. Since they were dealing with what they believed was a poaching incident at this time, the two officers, Officer Keller and Sidhu, contacted a conservation officer to help them out around 10:30 p.m. Once the conservation officer, who was Cameron Hill, arrived at around 11 p.m., he took Cody's statement again, which Cody repeated the deer hunting story, but he said he had a hard time believing that Cody's story was truthful. Hill then decided that he would make his way towards the logging road that Constable Keller had seen Cody drive out from, while Keller and Sidhu stayed with Cody where the truck and the police cars were. He tracked the alleged dump site of the deer by tracking tire prints and footprints off the logging road. In a bush near the gravel pit that was just off the logging road, Cameron Hill discovered the deceased body of 15-year-old Lauren Dawn Leslie, who was lying face down in the snow, and she was naked from the waist down. Her pants and underwear had been pulled around her ankles. Hill then phoned Constable Keller and told him that it was the worst case scenario and told Keller to come to look at the crime scene for himself. After this, Cody was now, instead of poaching, put under arrest for the murder of Lauren Dawn Leslie. He continued to deny ever knowing Leslie. At this point, he even turned to one of the officers and said that he had just happened upon her body. He had turned on that logging road and just discovered her body and then panicked and sped off. An autopsy of her body discovered that her cause of death was a combination of blunt force trauma and stab wounds, which was similar to Cynthia Maas' cause of death. She had been hit in the head and the face multiple times with a blunt object, stabbed in the throat, and one of her fingers had been broken because it appeared that someone had stomped on her hands. Similar to the other two girls women whose bodies were found, she had defensive wounds. Lauren's father, Doug Leslie, was called by RCMP officers around midnight on November 28th, 2010, and it was informed that his daughter's ID had been found in a car that had been pulled over on Highway 27. He was told that he would be phoned back by an RCMP officer when they had more information. He immediately called Lauren's mother, Donna Marie, who said that Lauren had gone out for coffee with a girlfriend and was not back home yet. Doug then called the RCMP repeatedly after this, but they had no new updates for him. So at around 2 a.m., Doug decided to just drive out to the scene of the crime himself to see if they could tell him anything. Once he arrived, he asked the three officers who were still present, Keller, Sidhu, and Hill, what was happening. They told him they weren't sure, but that they were investigating a homicide. So early in the morning of November 28th, 2010, Cody was transported to the Vanderhoof RCMP detachment to be booked and processed. I assumed he had already been sent to the detachment before Doug Leslie had arrived at the crime scene. He was photographed, and evidence such as his bloody clothing and swabs of the blood on his body were seized and taken. Over the next few days while he was in jail, Cody was interviewed repeatedly by officers at the precinct, and his story about what happened to Lauren changed multiple times. The first interview with Cody Legebokoff was conducted by Constable Yanicki later that day on November 28th for around 2.5 hours. A newspaper in Prince George posted the audio of this interview on SoundCloud, so I'll leave that link below if you want to listen to it for yourself. At this point, Cody had been connected to a lawyer, as it is a constitutional right to have counsel immediately after you're arrested if you request it, and his counsel had informed him not to talk to police during the interrogations. So for the first hour of this audio, so this interview, they don't really talk about anything significant about the case. But eventually, after just making small talk for an hour, Constable Yanicki gets him to start talking about Lauren Leslie. Initially, Cody just insists about the same story that he told Sidhu and Hill and Keller, which was that he was just cruising down Highway 27 and pulled off on a logging road where he just happened across Lauren's body. He said he left immediately because he was scared he was going to be blamed for her murder. Cody expands, saying he fled because he has a girlfriend who would soon become his wife, even though him and Amy had been only dating for 3 months. Anyways, he had a good paying job and he wanted to start a family soon, so he didn't want this discovery to ruin his life. He also said he had murdered a deer without a hunting license, so he didn't want to be arrested for poaching, which would also affect his job and his life. He said that when he had discovered Lauren's body, he had touched her belongings, so he gathered them all and took him with him in his truck to dispose of because he didn't want the DNA that he had transferred onto her stuff to be traced back to him. There were also scratches present on Cody's arms and palms, so Constable Janicki asks him about this, and he explains it away, saying they're just from being scratched by the trees in the bush. Then he explains that actually the blood that they found on his body and his clothing was because when he discovered Lauren, she was face down, so he turned her over to see if she was still alive. When he concluded she was dead, he turned her body back over. Then after this conversation, the interview ends and Cody is sent back to his cell. Throughout the interview, Janicki was pretty non-confrontational. He was sort of trying to establish trust with Cody. He was playing the good cop. A few hours later, around midnight, going into the early morning of November 29th, Janicki conducted the second interrogation or interview with Cody Legebokoff. Janicki was the primary interrogator in this one, but another officer named Sergeant Peter Tufik helped occasionally. During this interview, Tufik was considerably more tough on Cody because he was playing the bad cop role during the interrogation. At this point, officers at the precinct were also speculating that Cody may have also been responsible for Cynthia Maas' death because their cause of deaths were similar. So Tufik begins asking Cody questions about if he knows anything about Cynthia as well. The second formal interview lasted for around 4 hours, but Cody didn't budge despite Tufik trying to harass him and get him to open up. The third interview was conducted a few hours after that, around 8 a.m. by an entirely different officer named Sergeant Dadwal. Dadwal tried to use a different tactic. He realized that Cody's girlfriend Amy was a soft spot for him, so he brought up Amy to sort of try to get Cody Legebokoff to open up. Dadwal explained to Cody that he had previously talked to Amy and that Amy made it very clear that she loved and cared for Cody. Eventually in this interview, it seemed that the tactic did work, and Cody admitted that he had known Lauren before that night. He said that he had met her online on Nexopia and they had been talking for a few weeks. He then confessed they had actually met up that night at the elementary school and then had consensual sex in the elementary school parking lot. But then they drove off the logging road on Highway 27 to drive or ride quads. He said when he started driving along Highway 27, Lauren started hitting herself and screaming about how she hated her life. She hated her mom hated her. She had no friends. Cody said Lauren demanded that he pull over the truck, so he pulled over on the logging road, and then Lauren got out of the truck, grabbed the wrench from the floor of Cody's car and began hitting herself in the face and head with the wrench until she collapses on the ground. He then said he dragged her body into the bush that was just off the logging road and fled the scene out of fear. When he was again asked about Cynthia during this third interview, he again denied having any involvement with her, saying, quote, he didn't pick up hookers. Dadwal then, during this interrogation, started pointing out inconsistencies in Cody's story, including why her pants and underwear had been around her ankles when she was discovered. He said that he had dragged her body into the bush after she had hit herself and collapsed, so that was why her pants were around her ankles. Dadwal then contests this statement as well, saying that Lauren was wearing a belt, so if she was dragged, her pants wouldn't have fallen down like that, and that there was no snow buildup in the in her pants and underwear, and if she had been dragged like Cody said he dragged her, there would have been buildup. Cody then amended his story again, stating that him and Lauren had sex in the truck before she got out with her pants around her ankles and beat herself in the head with the pipe wrench. Dadwell then points out that this isn't possible because she couldn't have self-inflicted the head wounds to herself, because after just 1 or 2 hits to the head, she would have gone unconscious and wouldn't be able to continue to hit herself. Additionally, the coroner who had done Lauren's autopsy determined that the blows to her head had been done by someone immediately in front of her and not like self-inflicted. This time, Cody doesn't amend his story, he doesn't budge, and he continues to state that he didn't harm Lauren at all and it was all her. So that concludes the 3rd interview, and I guess Dadwell and the other officers realized that their way in was Cody's soft spot was his girlfriend Amy, so they allowed Amy to visit Cody that night at 7:30 p.m., hoping that he would confess what happened with Lauren to her. Sergeant Dadwell also moderated the couple's meeting, pressing Cody repeatedly to tell Amy what happened. Cody recounts the story that he had previously told Dadwell to Amy, and then Amy is immediately disgusted and disturbed that Cody had cheated on her with 15-year-old Lauren Leslie, as you know, because Cody alleged that the two had consensual sex 2 times that evening. But Cody continues to deny that he killed Lauren or harmed her in any way. He also adds that Lauren had actually slit her own throat, as the autopsy determined that she also had like stab wounds and puncture wounds to her neck. Amy asks Cody why, when Lauren was hitting herself, he didn't try to stop her or help her, and Cody says that he was frozen in shock. Constable Yanicki then enters the interrogation room to antagonize Cody and embarrass him in front of Amy by poking holes in his story. Yanicki points out that Lauren's death was a combination of stab wounds and blunt force trauma to her head. Since both were fatal wounds, she couldn't have self-inflicted both. She could have maybe done one or the other, but she couldn't have harmed herself both ways. Further, she couldn't have hit herself so many times in the head with the pipe wrench because she would have been incapacitated after 1 or 2 blows. Yanicki also brings up Cody's history with drug use, which Amy had no idea about up to this point. Cody confesses to Amy that he had used cocaine before he met her. Eventually, after more good cop, bad cop routine from Dadwell and Yanicki and some pleading from Amy, Cody concedes that Lauren did hit herself first, but he essentially finished her off by hitting her in the head with a pipe wrench 1 to 2 times to put her out of her misery. Cody tries asking again for Amy's forgiveness for what's happened, saying that she's the love of his life. Amy says she believes his story, but she won't remain with him. She can't continue to be with him for the rest of her life after hearing what she did. They hug and then she leaves. The meeting lasts for around 2 hours. After this, or simultaneously, Cody struck an apartment where he lived with his 3 female friends were searched in the following days or weeks, and evidence linking him to the deaths and disappearances of Joe Stuchenko, Natasha Montgomery, and Cynthia Maas were found. Joe Stuchenko's blood was found on the carpet and couch of Cody's previous apartment that he had lived in before his current one. Under examination, Cody's DNA matched vaginal and anal swabs taken from Jill's body. His DNA was also found underneath of one of Jill's fingernails when she was probably trying to defend herself. Cynthia Maas' DNA was found on a sweater and a sock in Cody's truck. They also found her DNA on a pickaxe that was in his apartment and running shoes. Natasha Montgomery, whose body still hadn't been found, her DNA was found on blood stains in 32 different locations around Cody Legebokoff's apartment, including the pickaxe that Cynthia's DNA had also been found on. They also found her DNA on Cody Legebokoff's shorts that he had been wearing the night of Lauren's murder. Based on this DNA evidence, Cody Legebokoff was charged with an additional 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Jill Stuchenko, Natasha Montgomery, and Cynthia Maas on October 18th, 2011. Meanwhile, through all of this, Cody is incarcerated at Prince George Regional Correctional Center awaiting his trial. Cody Legebokoff's trial began in June 2014 after being delayed twice, once in September 2013 and for a second time in October 2013. It was a jury trial and was presided by Judge Justice Glenn Parrott. Cody was represented by attorney Jim Heller, and throughout the trial, Heller tried to paint an alternative narrative about what happened during the 4 murders to try to make Cody look more innocent. In regards to his childhood, Cody testified that he began drinking when he was around 13 years old, and then he began using marijuana during high school. For the death of Lauren Leslie, Heller kept the same story that Cody had given in the interrogations. Heller submitted that Lauren Leslie was very mentally unwell and was suicidal, and then Lauren's parents did deny that Lauren suffered from any suicidal ideation. They said that she had occasionally struggled from depression and anxiety, but they didn't believe she was suicidal. Nonetheless, Cody and his lawyer still put forward the same story, stating that Lauren had bludgeoned herself to death and slit her own throat. Cody, who actually took the stand during his trial, said he had only hit Lauren with a wrench maximum 2 to 3 times after she had already bludgeoned herself. For the murders of Jill Stuchenko, Natasha Montgomery, and Cynthia Maas, Cody in his defense came up with a completely new story that no one had ever heard before. He said that the 3 women were murdered by persons X, Y, and Z, who were individuals that were involved in the drug trade, and that Cody had witnessed the murders but hadn't perpetuated them. Cody stated that he had met a drug dealer known as just X during the trial when he moved to Prince George from Alberta sometime between August to October 2009 at a house party hosted at the house that he was renting with his 3 female friends. Cody tried cocaine for the first time at this house party, and person X told Cody to contact him if Cody wanted more. Cody said that he then developed a friendship with drug dealer X, who began to trust and like Cody. Apparently, person X trusted Cody so much that he began bringing individuals he wanted to murder over to Cody's apartments where the murders would take place. Cody said that drug dealer X would bring a victim over to Cody's apartment accompanied by an individual, so either individual Y or Z, who would help carry out the murders and dispose of the body. Cody wouldn't participate in the murder, but he would supply drug dealer X with the tools that would be used for the murders. Thus, Jill, Cynthia, and Natasha were all attacked and murdered in Cody's apartment by persons X, Y, and or Z while Cody watched. But according to Cody, Cynthia's murder was a bit different. So Cody then went on to elaborate. He stated that Jill Stuchenko was murdered on the Thanksgiving weekend in October 2009. That weekend, all three of his female roommates had gone to their respective family homes back in Fort St. John. That weekend, all three of his roommates had gone home to celebrate Thanksgiving with his family, so he was alone in his rented house/apartment. Cody said X brought Jill and others, including person Y, to Cody's apartment that night to party and get high. Cody says he then started flirting with Jill, who he said he didn't know was a sex worker, because I don't know why that's relevant, but apparently it was to Cody. And then eventually Cody and Jill retired to his room and had sex, which was why Cody's DNA was found on Jill's genitalia. Then they returned to the party. X then took Cody to the side and told him that Jill was going to be murdered because she had a lot of drug debts. So Cody then gave person X a pipe wrench, which X used to murder Jill with the pipe wrench while X and others watched it happen. Or while Cody and others, sorry, not X and others, while Cody and others, including Y, watched it happen. Cody said after the murder, he helped X and Y put Jill's deceased body into X's car, and then X and Y drove off to dispose of Jill's body. According to Cody, the next murder that he witnessed took place a year later. So X and Y brought Cynthia Maas over to Cody's apartment where they partied again and smoked crack together. After getting high, X bludgeoned Cynthia to death in the apartment. Cody and Y then put Cynthia's body in Cody's truck and they all drove to LC Gun Park. When they arrived at the park, the two, Cody and Y, discovered that Cynthia was still alive. So Cody gave Y a picaroon from Cody's truck, which Y then used to stab and hit Cynthia, and which ultimately killed her. Then Cody says that Natasha Montgomery was the final murder that he was involved in with X. X brought a new muscle. Instead of Y, he brought Z, person Z this time, to Cody's apartment with Natasha and others. They smoked crack, and then X told Cody that Natasha needed to be murdered because she had pissed off some people and she owed a lot of drug debt. So X bludgeoned Natasha with a steel bar supplied by Z. X and Z then left with Natasha's body to dispose of. Cody Legebokoff refused to identify X, Y, or Z or provide any proof that they existed because he said he didn't want to be considered a rat in jail and that rats in jail got like beat up and hated on, whatever. Then this is what probably actually happened. These are the set of facts that are actually backed up by evidence that was put forth by the Crown at Cody Legebokoff's trial in 2014. So the Crown, which is the prosecution in Canada, was represented by attorney Joseph Temple, and he put forth this series of events. Temple suggested that Cody Legebokoff was addicted to cocaine and would employ the help of sex workers to get him cocaine. The Crown had more than one woman who were sex workers testify that they had done this sort of transaction with Cody Legebokoff in the past. Temple suggested that Cody didn't see the woman and girl, Lauren, that he murdered as good people. So it was easier for him to kill because they weren't good girls, like someone like his girlfriend Amy was a good girl that wouldn't be harmed. The killings were all sexually motivated. Justice Parrott determined that all four murders occurred either during a sexual assault or during an attempted sexual assault, though Cody tried to say that he had consensual sex with all 4 women. The judge determined that all 4 deaths occurred either during a sexual assault or during an attempted sexual assault, though Cody said this wasn't true, that he had consensual sex with all 4 victims. Temple then established a timeline of how he believed the murders played out, which I will recount now, and which I think are the most factual and are the most accurate thing we're ever going to get, because I don't believe Cody Legebokoff will ever tell us what truly happened. So Cody Legebokoff's first known victim was Jill Stuchenko. Cody invited Jill over to his apartment on Thanksgiving weekend, either on October 9th or 10th of 2009, when all of his roommates had gone back home to celebrate Thanksgiving with their families. Cody used Jill to supply him with cocaine that night. Presumably, they both smoked it together and got high. It was crack cocaine. They both smoked it together and got high. Then Cody tried to initiate sex with Jill, who refused, so Cody sexually assaulted her. As I said, she had signs of vaginal and anal tearing and a trauma, and Cody's DNA was found in these locations. He then murdered Jill because he was enraged that he tried to deny her while he was assaulting her. He murdered Jill by hitting her on the back of the head. He murdered Jill by hitting her in the head and the face with a blunt object. During the attack, Jill fought back, which is why she had defensive wounds on her body. Once the murder was complete, Cody tried to clean the apartment and scrub all the blood and stuff. He then disposed of Jill's body by driving out to a somewhat isolated gravel pit and buried her in a shallow grave. Temple says that Cody gave up halfway through digging the grave, which was why she was found half buried. Her body was then found on October 26th by Johnny Pius, who reported his discovery to a nearby RCMP detachment. After returning from visiting her family, one of Cody's roommates, Jana Lidl, went into Cody's bedroom to check on him, and she testified that she saw a blood stain the size of a melon on Cody's couch and another stain on the carpet. She asked him where it came from, and he replied that he suffered a nosebleed after getting high and fell asleep in a puddle of his own blood. Cody's second victim was Natasha Montgomery, even though he alleges that he killed Cynthia before Natasha, or Natasha was murdered after Cynthia. He alleges he didn't do it. So Natasha went over to Cody's apartment for the same reason as Jill Stuchenko, to supply Cody with cocaine. Natasha had been previously introduced to Cody by a mutual friend, Nikita, and they had gotten high together previously, so he knew she had access to the drug. So Natasha came over to Cody's apartment on either August 30th or September 1st, 2010. It is then believed that Natasha would die in a similar manner to Jill, by blunt force trauma during a sexual assault, but this cannot be confirmed, of course, because her body to this day still hasn't been found. But it is believed by the amount of blood that the murder took place on Cody Legebokoff's bed, which is why which validates the sexual motivation of the killing. It is then believed that Cody, like he did with Jill, tried and failed to clean up the mess. Of course, largely unsuccessful because Natasha's blood was found all over Cody's apartment. Temple then states that he believed Cody used the axe in his house to dismember Natasha to try to better dispose of her than he did with Jill, because he thought it would be easier to dispose of. Then he disposed of her remains, but of course, her disposal, where he disposed it, is still unknown because his first 2 murders were messy and he had a hard time cleaning up. Temple believes that Cody decided to change the location for the third murder. The third victim was Cynthia Maas. Cody met up with Cynthia in Elsie Gun Park sometime in mid-September 2010, for sure after September 10th when she was last seen, for the same purpose as Natasha and Jill, which was to supply him with cocaine. After meeting and getting high together, Cody attempted to sexually assault Cynthia. She fought back, so Cody murdered her by hitting her in the head, face, and chest with a blunt object over 20 times. He also stabbed her with a picaron in her chest and neck. Her cause of death was, of course, a combination of blunt force trauma and penetrative wounds. He then dragged her deceased body up to the tree line in the park and left it there. She was naked from the waist down, similar to Lauren Dawn Leslie. Her pants were around her ankles. Her body was then discovered on October 9th, 2010 by 2 officers who were patrolling the area. Cody's fourth and final known victim was, of course, Lauren Dawn Leslie. After Cody's girlfriend left his apartment on November 27th, 2010 at 6:30 p.m., Cody arranged to meet up with 15-year-old Lauren because he wanted to have sex. He then offered to buy Lauren alcohol, and even though Lauren made it clear that she didn't want anything sexual to happen between them through text, they met up at the local elementary school at 8:30 in Vanderhoof, which is where Lauren lived. They then arrived at the secluded logging road where her body was found around 9 p.m. after driving for around 20 to 25 minutes. While parked in the truck, Temple believes that Cody attempted to sexually assault Lauren. She then tried to escape by getting out of the truck and running. Cody caught up to her and hit her in the head with the pipe wrench. He hit her 5 to 8 times with the pipe wrench and then slit and stabbed her throat with the multi-tool knife twice. He then tries to conceal her body by dragging it into the bush, and since she refused his sexual advances, he left her half naked in a degrading manner with her pants and underwear around her ankles. They believe the assault and murder lasted 30 to 35 minutes. Then Cody tried to flee the scene and return to his apartment, which was when he was pulled over by Officer Sidhu and Keller. The Crown also found no legitimacy to Cody's story about persons X, Y, and Z murdering the 3 women. There's no evidence that ever happened, and Cody and his counsel never submitted any legitimate evidence to back it up. So on September 11th, 2014, Cody Legebokoff was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. He tried to appeal this decision in February 2015 based on the judge's refusal to change the location/venue for the trial and insufficient legal representation, but his appeal was denied. So that's the story of one of Canada's youngest teenage serial killers. He was 19 when he started killing, which is why they consider him teenage. That's the story of Cody Legebokoff. I hope you enjoyed it as much as you can enjoy a true crime story. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Let me know your thoughts on the case, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.